very much welcome again to the week in which we actually deal with NATO in a changing world. I have the privilege of introducing to you former Secretary General of NATO and Professor of International Relations and Diplomatic Practice here at Leiden University, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer. Thank you very much for being with us here today. The first question that I would like to ask you is, while you were Secretary General of NATO, we assumed that there were a multitude of challenges to deal with. What would you personally say was the biggest challenge that you had to address?
I think the biggest challenge was Afghanistan, a huge NATO operation with at a certain stage more than 150,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan, faraway country, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, different culture, different religion, different background, different history. All 28 NATO allies participating, many partners of NATO participating, Sweden, Finland, Japan, the United Arab Emirates. Combining the military with the political, rebuilding, trying to help to rebuild that nation, and at the same time fighting a war, there's no other word for it, was a highly complex matter for NATO, a highly complex challenge for NATO. The operation is now winding down, but that has dominated my mandate as Secretary General between 2004 and 2009 without any doubt.
I assume that actually coordinating the visions of as many members as NATO has must be a challenging endeavor sometimes. The changing membership of NATO, would you say that this is very much determining the new avenues of NATO, or do we essentially see the similar ways in which NATO has been operating also going on now?
Well, the changing membership is certainly a very important development. The bigger number of NATO partners participating in Afghanistan is a challenge in the sense that NATO allies take the decisions, but partners want to collectively shape the decisions, which was also quite an interesting challenge in Afghanistan. At the same time, also during my mandate, NATO enlarged. I started in 2004 with 19 allies. When I left in 2009, there were 28. With all their own interests, I say again, with their own geography, with their own history. Many nations having suffered tremendously under Soviet dominance and domination. So when I left, it was in that regard, not only geographically, but also politically, it was a different NATO than when I started.
I can imagine that these are huge changes in such an organization. Actually talking about the kind of changes, we have seen the European Union as a regional organization changing in terms of membership, actually enlarging. And the question, of course, that one can raise is there any avenue in which NATO and EU in some domains could be operating much more closely than they are now?
They should, and they do to a certain extent, but in my opinion, not enough. They're both in Brussels, both headquarters are located in Brussels, but they are far apart, not geographically but mentally. That has a number of reasons which have to do with the Cyprus problem, the position of Turkey inside NATO, the position of Cyprus and Greece inside the European Union. I'll save you those details. But sharing 21 members, it is an imperative, in my opinion, that NATO and the European Union work more closely together. The European Union will, without any doubt, having to face more responsibilities when the Americans, as we see now happening, have many other areas and regions of the world on their mind. The American President Obama has qualified himself as a Pacific president. He is dealing with the China Seas, with the Pacific. That means that more of the responsibility, of the burden, will fall on European NATO allies and on EU members for that matter. So it's really an imperative that they should work more closely together, but we're here very far from the ideal situation, in my opinion.
Thank you. Actually, some people have claimed that what we see now in the European Union is a slight trend since the Treaty of Lisbon towards increased intergovernmentalism, notably the European Council being a very dominant and prominent institution in the setting now. What is your opinion? Is this a general trend we are witnessing?
Yes, it's definitely a general trend. You do not only see that in the European Union, where the European Council the institutions where the heads of states and government meet, all by themselves, by the way, without collaborators, which leads to confusion from time to time, as we've seen in the recent past, where they have claimed we are the crisis mechanism, we are the heads of states and government, we are the highest level there is. I mean, there's nothing above us. And you see that in the United Nations framework, in the NATO framework as well. NATO has more frequent summits than it had in history. You see it in other international institutions as well, that slowly but definitely heads of states and government take over decision making. That has pluses, because they can really, at the final stage, come to a decision, because that's their responsibility as the highest in the land. It can also have minuses, because from time to time decisions are not properly prepared by defense ministers, foreign ministers, finance ministers. And that has also led to confusion from time to time, and to a sort of strange top-down process, where normally you would have finance ministers decide, and if they can't agree, bringing it up to heads of states and government. And now you see a decision by heads of states and government going down to finance ministers who say, why have you decided as you have? In other words, it can lead to some forms of confusion as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You can imagine that would happen. Actually, this brings me to the question. There's another organization of which some have claimed that it has become extremely important in today's structure of global governance, the G20. What kind of role do you think is there for the G20, and is it actually reflected sufficiently in the institutional global framework that we have today?
As long as the institutions we all know, the rules-based international institutions we all know since the Second World War and after, as long as they do not reform, as long as nations like Japan or India or South Africa or Brazil or Turkey do not have the voice in the international domain they should have politically on the basis of their economies, if the Security Council of the United Nations, which is the most important institution deciding about war and peace, still reflects the situation in the world as it was in 1945, where the nations who won the Second World War are coming together, added China in 1971, as long as the IMF and the World Bank, International Monetary Fund and World Bank, do not reform to give China, India and all those nations I mentioned a voice and a vote which is congruent to their position, you'll see G20 type of organizations emerge where they have a place at the table. And the G20 is a very important organization, did a lot of good work and positive things in the first financial crisis. There you see them sitting around the table, there they have a voice. The problem is it's not rules-based. And in non-rules-based organizations, it's usually the strongest nation prevailing. Why do we have rules? Because we also want to give a voice to the very small nations, the medium-sized nations. That's the idea of rules-based. Fair rules for everyone. So I'm not, let's say, judging the G20 in a negative sense, because they represent the majority of the world population, the majority of world trade. It's a very important group of nations sitting together. But it's not rules-based, and that's why I keep pressing for fundamental reform of the institutions and organizations we know. But it's very difficult because there are all kinds of political blockages. If I say India should definitely be a Security Council member, the big regional rival China will say, well, I don't know if that's a good decision. Pakistan will say, I don't know if that's a good decision for all kinds of political reasons, good or bad ones. And that has brought that process to a standstill, to the frustration of Kofi Annan, whom I respect and admire tremendously. I mean, he couldn't do it in the UN. So you will see G20 type of organizations and institutions popping up. Non-rules based, but necessary nevertheless.
Thank you. Actually, that builds a bridge to a topic we will deal with next week, Security Council reform, the challenges we have, the needs there may be, and the question, what can we do in order to increase, maintain, and even increase the legitimacy of this institution in global affairs? Well, this rounds off today's interview. Thank you very much, Professor Jaap.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.